Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings and welcome to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon of March 13th, 2022. Today we have an important conversation with regard to the subject of decentralization of power. This is an extremely important topic to discuss considering the state of the world today and a lot of the depredations that have been brought about by excessively centralized institutions, especially in the realm of politics and geopolitics, but also in the realm of smaller scale human interactions, various organizations, or what we see on social media with algorithmic censorship. So to discuss these issues, we have a distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, our Director of Energy Issues, John Karatz, and our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg. And our special guest today is Lincoln Cannon. Lincoln is a technologist and philosopher and a leading advocate of Mormon transhumanism. Lincoln is a founder of the Mormon Transhumanist Association and the Christian Transhumanist Association, whose leadership we previously hosted on our Virtual Enlightenment Salons when we had Carl Youngblood of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, as well as Micah Redding of the Christian Transhumanist Association. These are the world's largest advocacy networks for the ethical use of technology and religion to enhance human abilities. Lincoln is also a veteran in the business of technology. He has worked for large enterprises, including Ancestry, Merit Medical, Novell, Symantec, and WordPerfect. He has worked at startups, including Discerner and the World Table, and he has worked with investment firms, including the OS Fund. He is presently CEO at Thrivis, the human enhancement company. Lincoln received formal education in business and the humanities. He holds an MBA and graduated top tier from the Marriott School of Business. He holds a degree in philosophy and graduated with honors from Brigham Young University, and he is also an alumnus of the Exponential Medicine Executive Program at Singularity University. So thank you very much, Lincoln, for joining us today. It's an honor to have you with us. And can you please share with us your thoughts on decentralization of power, why it is important, how it can be achieved today, and how technology can help?
Sure. Gennady, thank you so much. The honor is mine for the invitation to speak with you today and with the U.S. Transhumanist Party. I admire the work you're doing personally, and as a group, I admire what you're all doing. And I'm particularly thankful that you are open-minded, good-hearted people who will bring others, such as myself, who have different views sometimes on transhumanism, to speak with you. And I think that is positive commentary on our movement, that we're able to come together, have important discussions, speak our perspectives, share them, interact with each other, critique each other, and do that with a mind aimed toward a better world for all of us. I really appreciate that about what you and the U.S. Transhumanist Party are doing. The topic that you mentioned, the decentralization of power, I share with you the sense that this is a highly important topic, and increasingly so. Not only because right now geopolitics have put us in a precarious position as a result of various centralizations of power, but also because emerging technology and scientific development continue to push us forward toward a future when we will be able to use unprecedented levels of power to do things that maybe only theologians and science fiction authors have imagined in the past. And the risks that attend those emerging technologies are nothing short of potentially catastrophic for humanity. Now, like most transhumanists, I'm optimistic about our future. I'm optimistic about what we will be able to do with these technologies. I trust that we are moving toward and eventually will live in a world beyond present notions of enmity and poverty, beyond present notions of death. And my hope and my confidence in that world is strong. But I think that it would be naive of us to aspire to such a world and work towards such a world without carefully considering the risks that we face. Many of those risks, perhaps the most important of those risks, presented by the technologies that we are developing, not only what we imagine to be technology in the traditional sense of perhaps machines, but also the technologies that we have developed and continue to develop on a sociological level, on a community level, where our forms of governance, the institutions that underlie them, are also forms of technology and also have their risks and opportunities. And they, of course, play in important ways to the topic that we'll be addressing today. My position on the decentralization of power is that it is absolutely essential to human thriving in the future. That decentralizing power is something that we must work on perpetually. There's no end to the effort, that we must work on perpetually to ensure the most beautiful, the most rewarding, the most creative and compassionate futures for humanity. And there's a basic argument, philosophical argument, that underlies my perspective, and it stems from work that has been done actually in the field of artificial intelligence. And I think we can transplant some of that philosophical work out of the field of artificial intelligence into, social science, sociology, and maybe the philosophy of communities and governance at large. One of the observations that has been made in research for artificial intelligence has come to be known as the orthogonality hypothesis. There's been some really great work done on this, and another hypothesis I'll be mentioning in a moment called the convergence hypothesis by philosopher Nick Bostrom. Anyway, the orthogonality hypothesis is the observation that the final goals of an intelligence, and you and I are among them, we're intelligences, any potential machine intelligences that we develop are intelligences, and in the broadest sense, even the non-general purpose machine intelligences that we create today, very simple computer programs are also intelligences. And maybe I would even take it further and say, in the broadest sense of intelligence could be defined as anything that optimizes across diverse contexts for a goal. So even a flush toilet could be maybe a very primitive form of intelligence. But the intelligences that we're most concerned about today are going to be intelligences of human level or higher, super intelligences. Anyway, the orthogonality hypothesis is the observation that the final goals of an intelligence and the magnitude of the intelligence are orthogonal. You cannot predict one based on the other. So, for example, some people have imagined and maybe hoped against hope, that if we become more intelligent as humans, perhaps attaining superhuman degrees of intelligence, or if we develop machine intelligence that is superhuman in its capacities, that it would necessarily be benevolent towards us because it's smart. Therefore, as the, and it's not really reasoning. It was more hope than anything. As it went, it was like, well, if it becomes more intelligent, surely it's more intelligent to be compassionate, right? Well, that doesn't play out that way, as it turns out. Intelligence can be used in myriads of horrible ways, and superintelligence can be used in myriads of super horrible ways. And we've observed that this throughout history, where people that were highly intelligent applied that intelligence to harming others. We've seen aggregations of intelligence, human intelligence, in centralized organizations such as corporations or governments, apply that centralized intelligence to do, in genocidal ways, and to engage in other horrible acts. In the study of machine intelligence, we can apply a whole bunch of computing resources to a particular program, but that program, in pursuit of its goal, might do horrible things in the process. There's nothing that ensures us that more intelligence or more information complexity is going to result in compassion or benevolence or ethics, whatever kinds of words you want to use. And that is the orthogonality hypothesis. I do think that there are some important caveats on the orthogonality hypothesis, and I prefer to call it the semi-orthogonality hypothesis because of those qualifications. The most important one being that I do think that we can eliminate large swaths of possibility space just based on the complexity of intelligence. So, for example, a simple intelligence cannot have highly complex goals. It's just not within its possibility space. To have a highly complex goal, you have to have the anatomy to support a highly complex goal. You have to be a highly complex intelligence. So there are ways that, based on the magnitude or the complexity of intelligence, we can eliminate certain kinds of final goals, perhaps based on their complexity. But for all practical purposes, especially when we start talking about human level intelligence and super intelligence, for all practical purposes, final goals and level of intelligence are essentially orthogonal. We cannot predict one based on the other for all practical purposes. That's the orthogonality hypothesis. And as you might imagine, that presents some serious risks. That makes intelligence, and especially accumulations of intelligence, superintelligence, highly risky. Not because it necessarily will do bad things, but because it could do bad things, very bad things. So that's the practical upshot of the orthogonality hypothesis, is that intelligence is risky. It presents opportunities, but it's also very risky. That leads us to the second of the hypotheses from artificial intelligence research that I think we can apply to intelligence in general, whether it's AI or human intelligence or aggregations of human intelligence into corporations and governments. And that's called the convergence hypothesis. And the convergence hypothesis is the observation that no matter how intelligent different entities might be, and no matter how unpredictable their final goals and might be, we still can predict that they are going to need resources to accomplish their final goals. And so there will be a convergence of instrumental goals around the acquisition and maintenance of resources, and also around the maintenance of their ability to pursue their goal by using those resources. So the convergence hypothesis is that although final goals might not be predictable based on intelligence, in general, instrumental goals are predictable to some extent, to some practical extent, because we all are here in approximate time and space with each other. And no matter what our final goals might be, we kind of all need the same resources to pursue them, or at least a significant subset of all possible resources to pursue them. We might need carbon, for example, to pursue our resources because our bodies depend on carbon to live. And we might need various forms of energy input to continue to pursue our goals. And as it turns out, all of the computing machines that we know of require energy inputs as well. And I can't imagine that any ever won't require energy inputs. So whatever provides energy, the acquisition of that thing is going to be a common instrumental goal between humans and machine intelligence and all forms of superintelligence. Because instrumental goals converge around resources, we know that we will come into tension or potential conflict around these resources. And these conflicts and tensions could be resolved in many ways, but we could probably categorize them in one of two major ways. One way we might call conquest. If one intelligence runs into another intelligence and they're both trying to get the same resources, and one of the intelligences considers itself to be far more powerful than the other, it really doesn't need to do anything to appease the other intelligence. It can just take away from that second intelligence whatever resources it wants. It can. I'm not saying it will. Again, it's unpredictable. Maybe it will have some kind of internal system it's developed that ensures that its ethics prevent it from doing so, and that would be nice. But again, we can't predict that based just on its intelligence. And so if there is a divergence, a large divergence in intelligence, or in power between these intelligences, then one of them might just choose conquest. One of them might just choose to take the resources it needs, despite whatever that might do to the other intelligence. On the other hand, if these intelligences that run into each other in the acquisition of resources that converge, and both need these resources, if they happen to be proximate in power, one not very much more powerful than the other, then the odds of them seeking to cooperate with each other around the acquisition of this resource go up immensely. It becomes much more predictable that they're going to try to cooperate in their instrumental goals because they can't be sure, either one of them, that they could just take what they want. And so that leads us to kind of an ethical conclusion. If you put together the fact that final goals aren't predictable, but instrumental goals are predictable around resources, and if you recognize that we can make the acquisition of resources, how we engage in that pursuit, more predictable by ensuring that there's not gross disparities in power, that creates an ethical responsibility for us to avoid creating, in the first place, those large discrepancies in power. That gives us an ethical obligation from the beginning to say, we don't all need to be the same. We don't need to be the Borg, but we do need to work to create a context, a world in which we as intelligences and machine intelligences and future super intelligent versions of ourselves and machines can operate, but not with so much disparity in power that it becomes a good bet that one intelligence could just take what it wants without being harmed by the rest of us, and despite what it might do to the rest of us. And so I call that last one the decentralization hypothesis, that the most predictable way to ensure the survival and thriving of humanity and our descendants and our creations going into the future is to decentralize power, because decentralized power increases the likelihood much, much higher, that intelligences will seek to cooperate with each other. And kind of a beautiful thing about this, if you want to press it to its limits, if you want to press decentralization of power to its limits, which in turn requires that we press cooperation, the incentive for cooperation to its limits. Think about what that looks like from a practical perspective. What does cooperation at its limits look like? And I would contend that cooperation at its limits is practically indistinguishable from compassion, and that's exactly the kind of world that we want to live in. And given the risks that we face, the gigantic risks we face with the levels of power that our technology may give us, that nothing short of the limits of compassion, the limits of cooperation that are practically indistinguishable from compassion, nothing short of that will be required for our survival and thriving going into the future.
Yes, thank you very much, Lincoln, for presenting quite an eloquent and sophisticated argument in favor of the decentralization of power. I think a lot of our viewers are quite impressed, and Mike Lezine notes, for instance, that Lincoln is making excellent points, and also we have a generous contribution already from Gloria Soria from Argentina. Thank you very much. So I have a few follow-up questions for you to perhaps ask you to elaborate on your premises. So you noted the orthogonality between intelligence and morality or cooperation as such, in that there's no necessary implication that just because a particular entity is more intelligent, it will treat others more favorably or cooperate with them, unless you set up the right incentives or it operates in a certain environment where there is a balance of power. However, do you at least see a correlation between greater intelligence and greater morality in terms of what we have observed empirically as human societies have developed, at least in terms of day-to-day existence? There are more incentives to cooperate rather than engage in conflict. And this is seen, for instance, in the decline in the rates of violence, at least in terms of day-to-day life, as Steven Pinker has observed, the expansion of global trade, global communication, cultural exchange. On the other hand, of course, we do see existential risks posed by concentrations of power, and the risk of nuclear war is a highly prominent one that should concern us all today. But do you see on net, as human intelligence expands and as the intelligence of our tools, of our creations expands, the space for cooperation generally predominating over the space for conflict? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I share your high esteem for Steven Pinker's work. I like what he's done, and I think that he's right, that the trajectory of history and has been towards decreasing violence at the scale of millennia, centuries, even decades on the whole. There have, of course, been various divergences from a perfect linear trend or exponential trend or whatever kind of trend it might be. But on the whole, I think we do see that, and I think his data backs that up well. I would attribute that trend not to the increasing intelligence of humanity in any simple sense. I would attribute that trend to the decentralization of power among human intelligences. Not only have we seen humanity increasing in intelligence, and by intelligence, of course, here I'm meaning all of the artifacts of human culture that we've created to make ourselves more intelligent collectively, but we've also seen an ongoing trend of decentralization. One of the most stark examples of that, of course, is the emergence of democracy, which was enabled by multiple technologies. One, of course, was just the technology of the idea itself. Ideas are technologies in maybe the broadest sense of the word technology. And the idea that a democracy could even be possible. And that was far more ancient in certain ways. The Greeks had some ideas around democracy and implemented some of them. But it took more than that to scale democracy. The idea wasn't enough. And one of the important technologies for scaling democracy was the printing press. And why was the printing press so important for scaling democracy? Well, the printing press decentralized knowledge in incredibly effective ways compared to everything that preceded it. And as a consequence, we shouldn't be too surprised to see that democracies started growing, scaling out, becoming more powerful, and at about the same time that these communications technologies, led by the printing press, and then others followed, the telegraph and such. And of course, the internet today enables us to communicate in very, totally unprecedented ways. All of these things are decentralizing technologies. So I would also then send our minds in another direction and ask ourselves, well, what would happen if instead of applying our rapidly improving technological power or rapidly increasing technological power, if we didn't apply it so much to decentralizing technologies, what if we started to apply it to centralizing technologies? For example, what if we intentionally tried to pursue a more Borg-like culture in the future? And some science fiction authors, of course, have explored these ideas, and the Borg being a great example. And some philosophers have explored them as well. There's this notion of a singleton, where a singleton could basically fold in all of the power of humanity in the future into itself. It may take away our ability to have much of what we might call agency or free will. And of course, there's philosophical arguments around how much we have of that in the first place. But kind of bracketing those, do we want to live in a world where we don't perceive ourselves the way we currently perceive ourselves? And of course, if we were to be in that world, we wouldn't know any different. We wouldn't by definition, it would take away our aspirations to be as we are now. But given that we are as we are now, do we want to see humanity become like that? In my mind, that would actually prove to be the extinction of what we know of as humanity. I think something about our interdependence is essential to what we value about being human. And so I don't think it's just, again, to go back to your question, I don't think it's just a matter of technological change and increasing complexity and technological power that has gotten us where we are. I think we've made some really good choices historically. Now, we've made some bad ones too, of course, but I think we've made some important, really good choices that have enabled us to decentralize power and scale out our decentralized institutions better than ever before. But we're not done. I mean, I would suggest that the Democratic Republic, the technology of the Democratic Republic that people in the United States know and love, right? That's what we live in, is a Democratic Republic. I would argue that it probably has reached its peak as far as its ability to promote human thriving, and that it's going to continue to need to evolve. Now, I'm not suggesting a revolution where we destroy I love the United States of America. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm saying we need to evolve. Some things need to change. We need new technologies that decentralize power yet further. And we need new ways of underpinning that effort with new institutions and new modes of thought, even, that help us achieve greater degrees of decentralization, because the risks of new technologies are increasing as well. And we have to mitigate those risks by further decentralizing and further mitigating the risk of centralizing those powers.
Yes, thank you very much, Lincoln, for your response. And I will say I agree with you that it would not be desirable to extinguish human individuality or to absorb human individuality into a Borg-like collective where each part essentially perceives what the whole perceives. And we have devoted a number of discussions on previous virtual enlightenment salons on the subject. I see the purpose of transhumanism as preserving the individual and preserving the diversity among individuals and enhancing that diversity. And of course, that too is a decentralized vision because we would have the option to connect with and cooperate with one another as we see fit, but we wouldn't, let's say, permanently dissolve ourselves in some collective pool of thought, so to speak. But I wonder, as a follow-up on my question of whether intelligence and morality are correlated, do you think that intelligence and power are strongly correlated, or are they also orthogonal in certain respects? As an example, one of the most brilliant people in history who has ever lived was Stephen Hawking. However, for the majority of his life, Stephen Hawking had ALS and he was paralyzed. And during most of his later years, he was only able to communicate by moving a single muscle in his lip. And of course, he had amazing technology for that time at his disposal, which enabled that act of communication to be translated into a voice and words that the rest of us could understand. So he could continue contributing his insights, but at the same time, he was exceptionally fragile. He had to have caretakers look after him all of the time. And if he didn't rely on this also fairly fragile technological infrastructure, he would have died much earlier. He would have died in his 20s or his 30s at the very latest. And on the other hand, we can think of situations throughout history when the most intelligent people, the most capable people were not necessarily the most successful. Even if you look at, say, the Paleolithic era, let's say some of our ancestors in the Paleolithic era were more intellectually inclined. They were interested, for instance, in creating tools. They were interested in creating art. They could have been the cave painters. They could have been interested in finding out more about the world that surrounded them peacefully. They could have gone on various exploratory journeys. But then in their tribes or in neighboring tribes, there were these tough guys with clubs who didn't particularly think very hard, but who could hit the intellectuals over the head with their clubs. And that would be the end of the intellectuals. And I suspect one reason why progress was so painstakingly slow during most of human prehistory was because the balance of power between the intellectuals and the tough guys favored the tough guys so heavily. We can think of countries today where the tough guys are literally in power. In Russia, for instance, there's this term called siloviki. These are the strong men. These are people who head the police apparatus, the military, the KGB, the FSB in Russia. And these people are very much in power. And the people who are the intellectuals, the people who are more interested in commerce or science, they're definitely low down the hierarchy of power. So they may criticize if they even get away with it, but they don't have the ability to alter the situation. So does it seem to you that there's a disconnect between intelligence and power that is very serious still in this world? And what can be done perhaps to better align the two in a way that reduces the dangers to individuals and to our species?
Yeah, I think some of this goes back to how we define intelligence and how we define power. As you may recall early on, I suggested that intelligence is well, I would say it's a subset of power. Intelligence is the power to achieve goals across diverse contexts. And so intelligence doesn't need to be conscious. It might all be if you're a panpsychist. I don't know. That's like another philosophical discussion entirely. But it need not be conscious to be intelligence. Intelligence is just power to achieve goals across diverse contexts. So it has to have a goal to be intelligent. And then at that point, you might look at, these Stone Age strong men and these Stone Age smart men and look at the conflict that they were involved in and try to figure out, well, where's the intelligence in that? Well, I would suggest that there's multiple kinds of intelligence at play. There's the intelligence of the brain itself, but there's also the intelligence of the body. Our body is filled with intelligence that isn't located in what we think of as being the theoretical or the analytical or the philosophical or the scientific. The body, the muscles, the cells, the bones, all of that, there's a great deal of intelligence just built into the system. Sometimes especially when we talk about non-human animals, but it's just as true about humans, we talk about instinct, right? They're acting on instinct. Well, instinct is an expression of intelligence. It's all goal-oriented. Mostly are based on survival because of many generations of evolution that trained the system to perpetuate itself by behaving in certain ways. And so I would say, well, let's be careful and let's not call the strong men of the Stone Age too stupid in the general sense. Their bodies were highly intelligent. The products of billions of years of evolution, magnificently so. But what they didn't have figured out yet is that the potential strength of the analytical part of their anatomy was just barely becoming recognizable. And then today, of course, because that aspect of human anatomy, of human intelligence, has begun to flourish. And I think it's just barely beginning to flourish, despite all the wonderful things that we see and observe and experience in our world today. It's just the beginning of our potential. But that is, that flowering of intelligence is another expression of human intelligence, which I think ultimately can be far more powerful, but innately wasn't, as you pointed out. It had to be developed more. So there's some strange complexities that arise because of the anatomy of intelligence, I suppose. And so what can we do then, to promote more of this flowering of human intelligence and make it, to magnify it even further and to make it so that instinctual, maybe Stone Age kind of thug expressions of intelligence continue to dominate less and less, as we've observed historically? Well, I would suggest that the answer to that question is the same as what we've already been talking about. We need to create a context where we increase the probability of that happening. That's number one. The probability of that happening when we centralize power decreases dramatically, because once you have centralized power, all it takes is one thug to come along, misuse that centralized power because they get access to it, and humanity is gone or wiped back into history 1,000 years or whatever. Bad things happen. If you want to create a context that gives us the highest probability chance of continuing to flourish, that's through decentralization of power, because in a decentralized power context, we all become way more predictable. We become much more cooperative as we seek to achieve our instrumental goals in mutually beneficial ways. And I can give you a dollar bill and I trust that you're going to give me the product that I bought back. If our power is too disparate, I can give you a dollar bill and you'll turn me into paper clips, to use the silly example from nanotech Grey Goose stuff, right? It doesn't care about a dollar bill. It just wants my carbon. So again, the answer to the question, how do we cultivate this? We start by creating a context that increases its probability, and that's a context of decentralized power.
Yes, thank you very much, Lincoln, for that response. And it's interesting that you conceive of intelligence more holistically, not just analytical intelligence or intelligence that stems from the human brain or the mind of another sentient entity, but intelligence doesn't have to even be conscious. Intelligence can be evolved. So a human body can have intelligence even though we're not consciously directing certain functions of the body. Nonetheless, the body is an extremely sophisticated type of structure, and it certainly, in many respects, still baffles even leading scientists today. There are various aspects of human metabolism, for instance, or how the human nervous system works that are unfortunately still not well understood. But it is true that they lead to outcomes which are complex and adaptive in a way that could be considered intelligence. So I appreciated that discussion from you. Also, I want to acknowledge Duke Nukem for his generous contribution. Now, if anybody remembers the 1990s and the Duke Nukem games, it is interesting, I will say, that we have Duke Nukem contributing to our discussion on intelligence. Because I think that character is very relevant when we consider questions of intelligence and power. Now, Duke Nukem was on the good side. He is the protagonist of those games. He finds himself in a world surrounded by hostile aliens, and he has to fight his way out. But it's an interesting question to consider in terms of the role that character would play in the dynamic between intelligence and power. I'll leave it at that. But also, we have an interesting comment from Dan Elton, who says that he agrees with Lincoln 100%. And he says, unfortunately, AI is becoming more centralized in large companies, since only large companies can afford the compute, so the computing power right now. And as an example, he gives GPT-3, which is a very advanced AI language, and people interacting with GPT-3 programs essentially sometimes do not distinguish between that and the dialogue that's generated by a human. Now, if you probe further, if you ask certain kinds of questions, or if you ask GPT-3 to make quantitative comparisons, then perhaps a different picture will emerge, and it may be possible to distinguish what is coming from GPT-3 versus what is coming from a human. Nonetheless, it is a significant advance. So in terms of centralization of AI development, Lincoln, do you see a risk in that? Do you think that there's a danger that AI may be taken down certain paths that it wouldn't be taken down had a more extensive and diverse but less individually well-resourced set of people contributed to the progress of AI?
Yeah, I see huge risks in the centralization of AI. The tools that we're using to develop AI will be the tools that we use to develop both artificial artificial and symbiotic superintelligence. And what I mean by symbiotic is that the time will come when some of us will choose to enhance our bodies and brains in ways that will make us much more intelligent than we are now. And we'll do that by applying tools that most likely are developed as part of what's currently known as AI research. So AI won't just remain artificial. It will integrate with the biological. It will become part of who we are. And so I foresee there being both biological, symbiotic, and artificial machine intelligences, superintelligences in the future. And if we have not ensured broad access, generally available and generally affordable access to these technologies, to the technologies of artificial intelligence and human enhancement, we will develop concentrations of power that are truly unprecedented. And maybe we'll get lucky, right? Maybe we'll get lucky. One of those concentrations of power will be this magical unicorn that happens to love everybody just cuz. You know what? Wonderful if that happens. But if we're betting on that, we are stupid. We are morons. We are fools. We cannot bet on the future of humanity on luck, that something will just happen to be nice to us. Maybe we'll end up having to just cross our fingers because maybe it will be out of our power. But so long as we have power, so long as we have influence, so long as we have resources, so long as we can do anything at all about this, we need to work toward ensuring that access to these technologies are generally available and affordable. In other words, that they're decentralized. Open source, that's a great movement. Other more recent changes in technology, the most important of which is probably blockchain technologies. Those are important ways forward. And there will be other things, but we have to take advantage of the power we have now to ensure that we don't just relinquish it all into the hands of luck in the future, because the day after the unicorn, we will have a basilisk, and it will be ugly.
Indeed, that is a concern, and we are already starting to see abuses of AI when there are large centralized entities deploying AI in certain contexts where the results are detrimental, for instance, to freedom of expression or the ability of people to carry on interesting conversations. And this, I think, is a good bridge into an experience that you've had, Lincoln, with algorithmic censorship, because there was an example of Facebook using a narrow AI system in the wake of the most unfortunate January 6th riot, where Facebook became all of a sudden hypersensitive and began to ban people with no explanation, just delete their accounts. And many of these people were at a loss as to why this banning took place. We've spoken before with Jim Rutt about his experience where his account had also been deleted for several weeks. And our director of scholarship, Dan Elton, had his account deleted as well and then reinstated. But I'm curious if you could tell us in your own words what happened to you. Why do you think it happened to you? And what did you learn from that experience regarding algorithmic censorship and the dangers of excessively centralized AI?
Yeah. As you mentioned, I was algorithmically banned from Facebook. I woke up one morning and was, just checking my messages, and I had a message from somebody on Facebook, and I went to go reply to it, and I couldn't log on to Facebook. It told me, I don't remember the message offhand exactly what it said, but something about my account being deactivated or inaccessible. And I was surprised. I thought, well, maybe Facebook's down. And I went and I checked with some family and friends. No, they're all able to get into Facebook, but I can't get on. And then verified from them that they also were getting messages saying that my account was no longer active. So I started to speculate about why it would have been deactivated. My initial hypothesis was based on my pattern of posts that I had been putting up in the days and weeks that led to that day when my account was banned. And those posts had, by and large, ironically, been about decentralization technologies and decentralization philosophy. kinds of things that we're talking about right now. And so because I had been writing about those things so much, I thought, I wonder if somehow the Facebook algorithm went into self-preservation mode because I actually had been explicitly critical of Facebook for being too centralized. And of course, that wasn't new. I honestly, I've never liked Facebook. I use Facebook because I kind of have to for the kinds of things I care about, for engaging in social interactions and discussions. And so many people are there. I mean, you know, if I didn't use Facebook, I would be in a lot of ways disenfranchised, I suppose would be the word that comes to mind. Anyway, that was my hypothesis, is that because I had been critical of Facebook and advocating decentralized alternatives, that somehow I got caught in a self-preservation algorithm and it just booted me. So I started trying to contact. I'm in a fortunate situation compared to a lot of people. I have lots of friends in the technology industry. So I was reaching out and was able to get in contact with some people inside of Facebook. And they started doing some digging for me. And it was hard, actually. But eventually figured out kind of what went on, and I'll describe that in a second. But before we figured out exactly what happened, they were able to eventually get my account reactivated. And from what I understand, that entailed some people vouching for me or something like that, that they knew me and that I apparently not trying to destroy the world or something. I don't know. Anyway, once we got the account reactivated, I followed up with them and I told them, listen, I've published an article saying what Facebook did to me and my speculations about why, but I don't really know. I'd love to confirm and either change what I wrote or expand on what I wrote if it's helpful. I mean, I don't want to misportray what happened. And so they did more research to help me out. And as it turns out, what ended up happening was that I was a member, an inactive. I think I actually had been added by a friend to a group years ago that I had never participated in, but I was a member of it. And they had made me an admin of the group. And the algorithm had gone through checking for all of the groups on Facebook where anybody was mentioning certain keywords related to QAnon. And they shut down all of those groups. And they banned all of the admins of all of those groups. And because I was a completely inactive admin of a group that mentioned a keyword related to QAnon, I got caught in the dragnet and my account was banned. So that was what ended up really being the cause. It wasn't the nature of my own posts. It was the nature of my relationships on Facebook. And so, you know, reflecting back on this, one of the things that comes to mind is something that I already knew, but that I just kind of accepted as a risk. And that is Facebook is a highly centralized organization that can take away everything that I put into it anytime it wants. And it did. And let me tell you, even though I don't like Facebook, the feeling I had when they took away my access to 15 years or whatever it is of interactions with other people through their system was really violating. It did not feel good. It made me angry. And that's still a risk. And so, you know, I regularly, and before this, I already engaged in this practice. I regularly back up what I can from Facebook, which isn't everything. But that's something I've never liked. I liked the world before Facebook when we all had our own blogs and we would comment on each other's blogs. It was much more decentralized, but it was harder for a lot of people. It required more technical skills of a lot of people. And so I understand why things like Facebook caught on and became much more popular than the old way of doing things. Another lesson, though, that comes to mind is that, you know, we have this problem And there are good practical reasons why Facebook has been successful. Maybe what we need to do is work on improving the usability of decentralized technologies so that people like my mother don't have to choose between the two. I want to communicate with my mother in social situations on the internet. She can't do that in a lot of platforms that are just too hard to use. She can do that on Facebook. My grandparents are still alive and they can do that through a Facebook portal in their home. And that is a beautiful thing, right? I love the fact that right now I can hit a button on my phone and it will flash a screen in my grandparents' room, and they'll just press one button and we're talking to each other face to face. And they live up in Washington State. I live here in Utah. And I love that. But the downside is that it's relying on this centralized platform that could take that away from us anytime that it whimsically chooses to, for any reason, really. There's no recourse. I got lucky. I just happen to know. What about people who don't have those relationships? They just lose it. And so the big takeaway for me from this is that and I hope all of you, to the extent I can persuade you, should be supporting and or working on new technologies for communicating with each other, new social networking technologies that take away the centralized power, that make it so we don't have to go through the Facebook gatekeepers. Now, some people get really afraid when they think of this and say, well, what about all the misinformation? If we don't have this centralized gatekeeper to nanny us or to police us, then all kinds of bad things will happen. And well, let me first of all say bad things are still happening with the centralized gatekeeper, A. But B, who says that there can't be regulation in a decentralized system? Even regulation can be a decentralized process. And on top of that, if we do have a decentralized regulatory process, doesn't that become more trustworthy? For all the same reasons we've talked about everything being more trustworthy and dependable, higher probability of improving in cooperative incentive. And so that's the kind of technological paradigm I think we should be aiming at, but we won't get there if it's hard to use. So we need to make it easy. We need to invest our support, at least, first of all, our verbal support, but we need to support it with our dollars. We need to support it with our time. We need to support it with our development skills. If we're software engineers, we need decentralized forms of communication, of social networking. And yes, we also need decentralized ways of regulating them. And so let's work harder on making both of them, and they need to be easy to use. And they need to be things that, my grandparents and my mother can use. And importantly, not just because they have money or something like that, but also for people who are not wealthy all over the world can get on these things and easily use them without having to have large financial resources. That is going to create a confluence of communication, of understanding, of empathy, of working together in a decentralized way to achieve our common goals. And that will be a highly dependable system for developing a better world, as we've talked about for the philosophical reasons we've already talked about.
Yes, thank you, Lincoln. And I would like to expand upon the discussion of how technologically we can get to this point where people have more access to various means of communication, various types of communication, and also the infrastructure is more resilient against the ability of one centralized entity to insidiously come to control, for instance, what people may or may not say and what happens to people if they get caught in the dragnet as you were. First, though, I'd like to acknowledge the generous contribution from John H. And now here, I do disagree with John's statement about what he doesn't have to say, because I think he had some great comments in our chat. He wrote, for instance, force will be an issue as long as the thinkers are susceptible to serious damage or death from the club bearers. So that's worth considering as well. How do we insulate ourselves from those who would resort to essentially crude physical force to resolve their disagreements, whereas those of us who prefer the analytical forms of intelligence would favor methods such as persuasion or cooperation or technological innovation. John also writes, even Klingons in Star Trek get that they need the thinkers to stay in the game against the Federation and the Romulans. So point well taken there. But in terms of decentralized social networks or decentralized methods of communication, I agree with you, Lincoln, that the pre-Facebook world, the pre-social media world was better. The world of the early internet gave me great reason for hope and optimism about the intellectual future of the human species, because here was all of this access to information, but of course people had to be actively engaged with it. They had to go out to various blogs and publications and news sites and encyclopedias and forums and essentially critically think about the information that they encountered. It wasn't fed to them in some sort of algorithmically customized manner that suited their pre-existing demonstrated preferences, but could have kept them insulated from other content that might have given them a different perspective. And also, of course, you're correct that a greater technical skill set was required to engage with that earlier internet. But in some ways, that was also a selection mechanism so that the people who didn't have those technical skills couldn't just essentially spout random uninformed comments or amplify misinformation. So that technical set of de facto requirements actually served to create a space where the discussions could be more intelligent as well. And obviously, we don't want to block anybody or bar anybody from using these technologies if they want to use them. But I'm wondering, how can we create more of a space that resembles the early internet and doesn't exhibit all of these problems of centralized social networks? And what technologies do you think could be brought to bear to create such a world?
I'm a big fan of blockchain technologies in general. And, I say that, let me simultaneously acknowledge that there are Ponzi's and there are, there are a lot of problems still to solve in the space. But that doesn't mean that there's not also a lot of good things happening. And this is always true of emerging technology. You go back and you look at the beginning of the internet, there were a lot of really stupid things happening at the beginning of the internet too. And the critics of the internet would point at those stupid things and say, see, this is what the internet is for, and nothing will ever come of this because everybody who is advocating the internet is clearly a moron and interested in their own self-interest. And I don't know, if you go back and you read the criticism of the internet, the same criticisms are being leveled at blockchain today by the same kinds of people and are, just so you know, just as untrustworthy as those early critics were. That doesn't mean there aren't real problems to solve. There are real problems to solve. Anyway, blockchain technology, there are a number of development groups working on social networking protocols and platforms using different blockchains, either building on top of existing blockchains or building blockchains that are made for the specific purpose of social networking. I think that's great that different avenues are being pursued. That's another form of decentralization, competing technological implementations. We one of the challenges, though, with making this happen will be to change the way that people think. And the reason that's so important is that we get into habits and ruts. And right now, it's very easy for all of us to, many of us, all is an overstatement, the majority of us to log into Facebook. It's just easy, right? Everybody's there. I can just open it on my phone or my computer. I can type my reply to this thing that either infuriated me because the algorithm showed it to me because it knows I'll engage when I'm furious or whatever. It's easy. It's our habit. It's what we're used to. And habits don't change without incentive. That's just how humans are. And so we need to change the way that we think, and the way to change how we think about engaging socially is to change our incentives. And that really is the power, one of the powers of blockchain technology. Blockchain technology has demonstrated over and over again that it can change incentive structures. It can motivate people to use new systems because it aligns their economic interests, their economic goals. And by the way, economic goals, those are the instrumental goals that we talk about when we're talking about the convergence hypothesis. Economic goals are the way that we cooperate with each other. They are the things that align us towards greater cooperation, no matter what our final goals are. I can use $1 to go buy a plane ticket to visit my grandparents. You can use that same dollar to buy a book, a book from your favorite author on Amazon or whatever, right? So by aligning our economic interests, by changing our economic incentives, by giving us ways of amassing economic power that we can use to pursue our final goals, blockchain technology is pulling people in. It's giving us a reason to do it. And when we have economic changes, economic incentives in place, it gives us incentive to rethink things. It gives us incentive to change our habits, to open up our minds to new possibilities because we have incentive to do so. It's amazing what a little bit of economic incentive will do. And so this can be used for good or bad. It's not necessarily good, right? If we use these economic incentives to cheat each other in Ponzi schemes or whatever, the bad take on the blockchain is of the day, well then yeah, we'll hurt each other and we'll use that power for bad ends. But we have the choice also to use the power of shifting economic incentives to refocus our minds at good things too. So as we use the blockchain to create social networks, I think we should recognize it's already demonstrably have the power to get our attention, to get people's attention, to get them using it because it gives them economic incentive to do so. But then we still have ethical deliberation to engage in. We have questions to answer about how best to do this so that we don't perpetuate maybe some of the manipulative ways that social networks have engaged with us historically. And I'm optimistic that we can, solve those problems too. And it would be interesting, and this is something that I don't know if anybody's really working on yet, but it would be interesting going forward to explore how do we then develop decentralized regulatory systems, decentralized arbiters of ethics, systems that engage in kind of refereeing what all of these blockchain social networks are engaging in a virtuous feedback cycle where I don't know exactly how they would work, but maybe they would have the ability to apply or retract resourcing from some of these networks based on whether they adhere to a decentralized consensus around the ethical application in their particular network of those resources. Again, I don't know for sure how this will work, but what I do know is that there's a lot of potential here and that humans are very creative and that we've already been creating really incredibly imaginative and wonderful systems on the blockchain already, and that is just getting started, just barely.
Yes, thank you, Lincoln, for highlighting some of the possibilities for us. Now, I'm curious how you would address this observation. Mike Lazine writes, the problem with social media is that there are other platforms out there besides Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, but they are not widely used. And I can second that. I have seen various platforms, including those that are blockchain based. Let's hope YouTube's algorithm does not ban me for highlighting a competitor of YouTube, Odysee. I do have an Odysee channel, by the way, where all of these videos are backed up now. But Odysee works on a blockchain premise as well, and yet a video published to Odysee these days is not going to get nearly as many views as a video published to YouTube. And along these lines, Jason Geringer wonders, how can we build a decentralized social media platform? I would add, how can we build a decentralized social media platform that attracts the critical mass of people so as to create the principal reason why people go to Facebook today, which is that they expect other people to be on Facebook, whereas they might not expect other people to be on, say, Parler, unless they belong to a particular demographic in terms of political persuasion. And it seems to me one possibility in this regard would be not to have a single platform that is just another competitor to Facebook de facto, but to have some meta level aggregator, not meta as in the company, but meta in terms of being a layer above all the social networks. So let's say you have a single platform that somehow runs in a decentralized manner, so it's not controlled by a given corporation, but where you can get all of your communications in one place. So any messages, posts, etc., that you wish to interact with on Facebook, but also anything from Twitter, anything from Odysee, anything from Parler, anything from any number, maybe tens of social networks that you might have an account on. And you, through this higher meta layer, are able to engage with them in the exact same way, and your response then feeds back into the original platform, into Facebook or Twitter or whatever alternatives that you're using, so that for you it's a seamless experience. Because I think right now people are still finding it a bit cumbersome to manage tens of different accounts of various social networks. So that kind of aggregator could be the replacement for logging into Facebook directly and looking at one's Facebook feed. And it could also be independent from all of the individual social networks. Do you think this could be achieved through decentralized technologies?
Possibly so. I don't think, however, to be honest, that aggregation will be sufficient. The reason I don't think it will be is that there's been a lot of effort already put into such systems historically. And we actually were closer to having viable aggregators for social media 10 years ago than we are probably today. And the reason is that the centralized powers, the Facebooks of the world, shut down a lot of the APIs and other means of accessing their systems that the aggregators were using to make the aggregation systems really effective. And it became harder and harder to run these aggregation systems. They were broken with increasing frequency, and people stopped using them. And so, whether we implement an aggregation social network on historical, Web 2 technological platforms, or whether we put it on Web 3 blockchain platforms, I don't think that makes much of a difference, because I think it's actually the paradigm that's kind of problematic. The centralized social networking powers have the power. So probably what we need to do, if we're going to achieve decentralized social networking, is come up with a way to incentivize people to actually change to a natively decentralized social network. And I don't know who will crack the nut, so to speak, on how to make that incentive really go wild and get out to lots of people and get critical mass. But I really think that's what needs to happen. But it probably won't happen until the usability of such a system is much better than anything I've so far seen among decentralized social networking efforts. And simultaneously kind of doubles down on the economic incentives of making a switch, which is a strength of blockchain. So I think that will be pretty achievable. So probably usability will be a big deal. And then once the usability is really good, targeting lots and lots of people with economic incentive to switch.
Yes. Thank you, Lincoln. And along these lines, Jason wonders, would there be a way where we all own our own profile pages, for instance, if the information on one's page is in not necessarily a blockchain wallet, but on some sort of blockchain that is under the user's control and that no centralized entity can take away. And maybe even that information could be migrated to various social networks that do allow the APIs or other interfaces to make it happen.
Yeah, that's technically feasible today. In fact, there are companies that have created blockchain-based profiles that you can use. Of course, the biggest problem today is that almost no platform providers will integrate with those profile systems. So it's kind of, gee whiz, I created a profile today, there's not much really to do with it. But that, hopefully will change in the future. And so I would imagine that kind of suggests to us that the problem isn't so much the profiles, because those we can create for sure today. They exist today. The problem is the decentralized communication itself, having a really easy to use, friendly, accessible system for sharing photos of our favorite cats with our favorite family members, arguing about transhumanism and fundamentalist religion with our favorite antagonists in a decentralized fashion. When that's really easy to do, and then on top of it, I get paid to do it because the system benefits from me using it, I think that's what will pull people in. And then, having a profile there, that's a solved problem, I think.
So do you think that's primarily a technical problem to overcome, or is it primarily an institutional problem to overcome, in that it would have been solved by now had the large social networks that currently have most of the traffic not resisted as much as they have?
Probably some of both. Historically, maybe more resistance from the centralized powers, but today there's been so much capital put into blockchain networks. There is more than enough money floating around blockchain networks, and more than enough blockchain software engineers to be working on this problem. And many are. There are teams of people working on decentralized social networks. I think the real problem at this point is achieving a really highly usable system, one that feels easy to use, one that's inviting to look at, one that doesn't require that my mom even know what Bitcoin or Ethereum or blockchain are. Nobody should have to know these things. It needs to be super easy to use, super good looking, and at the same time provide an incentive. And so I just think that at this point, the biggest hurdles are technological and not disincentives from the centralized powers, although historically that may have been what maybe slowed it down.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Lincoln. And I'm wondering, Jason, if you have any follow-up questions or comments on this subject.
I remember Ben Goertzel and the guy from Cardano had a discussion talking about all this. Ben Goertzel had this algorithm that he made that he gave to this guy. I don't know if he gave it, but Anton Kolonin, and then he's got this AI Gents. It's just like it tracks your social network. It can also track like hierarchy, like who's your friend, but also probably, above you. And so, yeah, there's all this technology here. We just need somebody to do it for us, because I sure don't know how to do it. I need to learn how to do some more programming, that's for sure. But
well, yeah, I mean, that's one avenue is for you to learn how to do more programming, and if you have that desire, by all means, it's a great profession, of course. But at the same time, human civilization and what we aspire to live in, the more beautiful world we want, will depend on artists and politicians and business people and teachers and myriads, police officers, whatever, myriads of other professions as well. None of these is more important than another for the kind of world that we want to live in. And when it comes to developing decentralized social networks, writing the code is not at all, of course, the only important part. There are project managers, there are investors, there are ethicists, there are all kinds. There's the users themselves, the creative people who put something worth even looking at on these networks. Social networking is, in many ways, a way for humanity to express itself to each other more fully than we ever could before. So it really does take all of our skill sets to build this out. If you want to be a software engineer, awesome. But there's a lot of other ways you can contribute too.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response, Lincoln. And also in our YouTube chat, Art Ramon mentioned two services. One of them I have quite a bit of nostalgia for, and that is GeoCities, because my first website was created using GeoCities back in 2002. And it was so unfortunate when Yahoo, a large centralized corporation, acquired GeoCities and essentially destroyed and then discontinued it, because any acquisition of Yahoo is like the kiss of death, essentially. A few years after Yahoo acquires any sort of promising startup or platform, Yahoo, through mismanagement, runs it into the ground and then shuts it down, because Yahoo destroys whatever was unique and distinctive and attractive about that service. So this happened with GeoCities, and GeoCities was a principal reason why the early internet was as vibrant and robust and interesting as it was, because it was a fairly low-tech way for people to create their own websites and publish their own content. And yes, you had to have a geocities.com link, but during the early 2000s, people didn't really mind that as much. And as a result, there was just a lot of grassroots engagement. Art Ramon also mentioned a service called Flipboard, and I'm wondering, Art Ramon, if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think Flipboard used to be sort of an aggregator, so you could aggregate from other social media platforms, and I believe it was on tablets. I know I had it on a device, and I haven't heard from it in a very long time, so I assume they're defunct or close to it. But I did want to sort of elaborate on decentralized power. I think one of the problems that we have is that humans are just biologically programmed to sort of alpha worship. And that's how you have these club-bearing populists who come to power. And, you see it in politics like Trump, and business like Steve Jobs, and religion like the Pope. So I think what we might have is a unicorn, sort of a philosopher king that might be Elon Musk. So I'm hoping Elon Musk can be sort of that philosopher king, because he's working on artificial intelligence for the self-driving cars, which eventually is going to lead to, AI traffic lights, and eventually the elimination of those traffic lights. And I think if he keeps pushing, he could start doing AI trash service and other city services, and eventually replace like the city council. So AI slowly moving from the municipal local area, and he's already building the infrastructure for that symbiosis. I mean, he's creating Starlink, which is the mesh, the global mesh that could become the infrastructure for a hive mind. And he's of course doing Neuralink. So maybe with that Neuralink, we could sort of override that biological programming to alpha worship, and then maybe we could start going decentralized. So do you think Elon Musk has a chance of anyway being at the forefront of decentralization with the technologies he's working on, which I see as infrastructure for decentralization and a hive mind?
Yeah, what an insightful and important observation. Alpha worship and its risks. And unfortunately, those risks very often turn out to have tangible, negative, very negative consequences in so many ways. And this, of course, gets back to the philosophical argument that I shared right at the beginning. Alphas are, by definition, a concentration of power. And alphas, when they have that concentrated power, there's nothing guaranteeing that they'll use that power ethically. They're not constrained as much as the rest of us with the need to cooperate. And so they can use that power in ways of conquest, in oppressive ways, in ways to do whatever the hell they want, despite how it affects the rest of us. And the reason I think that this observation that you've made is so important is that we create a world, we create a future based on what we worship. And if you're not a religious person, you can use some other word for worship there. You can use the word hope. You can use the word emulate. You can use, if you trust that someday there will be superintelligence and you have an imagination of what that superintelligence might be like, the fact that you're imagining superintelligence in such a way and aspiring to somehow make that come to pass, introduce it into the world, or become such yourself, has practical consequences here and now in the way that you interact with people around you. And those interactions have consequences in the way that communities form and the world is shaped. Our theologies, our gods, going back thousands of years, whether or not you think those gods exist out there, they have existed in our hearts and minds so powerfully that they've created the world that we live in through our actions, through our aspirations to worship them in the ways that we have believed are right or wrong. And when we have imagined horrible gods, oppressive gods, terrifying gods, what have we done? We have acted in horrible, terrible, oppressive ways to appease those gods. When we have imagined and worshiped compassionate gods that want the world to be a beautiful place, what have we done? We've acted like those compassionate, world and life-affirming gods and made the world a better place. Our gods and our imaginations of superintelligence shape the world. I wish I could emphasize that even more. Your imagination of superintelligence, your faith in God, if you're a religious person, is shaping the world. And if you are worshiping an evil God, or if you are worshiping an evil superintelligence that would oppress the rest of us for whatever its value system is, then you're making the world a worse place as a consequence. And so now take this one step further, a little bit more nuanced, because sometimes we think, oh, I'm not worshiping an evil God. I'm not worshiping an evil superintelligence. I'm not aspiring to develop an evil superintelligence. I want the superintelligence that I create to solve all of our problems for us. But to do that, I have to give it all the power in the world. But think about what you're saying when you say that. If you create a superintelligence that has all power, it will destroy the world, I bet. But you don't know for sure. You can say it's going to make the world a better place, but that's a gamble. When you centralize all of that power into a superintelligence, it's a gamble. How does this apply to religion? How does this apply to God? If you are worshiping a God that wants to raise itself above all of the rest of us, so far as I'm concerned, you're worshiping Satan. I'm sorry to say that. You are worshiping a God that increases risk for the world, that produces destruction, that produces escapism and nihilism. If you want to worship a God that's worthy of worship, you should choose to worship a God that would create more gods, a God that looks at us, humans, as its children, that can become gods ourselves, the same as all other gods have done before. I know this is controversial theology that I'm engaging in, and I know that this is likely to offend some people, but I feel that this is so deeply important. Our theologies are shaping the world, and even our conception of God must be decentralized or we will damn ourselves.
Very interesting. Thank you, Lincoln. And Daniel states, good advice, become the right kind of ancestor. So thank you for that insight, Daniel. And it's interesting, this definitely feeds into the discussion of creating AI, because as we spoke a little bit prior to the start of our salon, in some ways, humans are in the role that is at least quite similar to the role that many humans have attributed to gods when they embark on the project of creating artificial intelligence, especially artificial general intelligence or artificial super intelligence. And we had a book that we discussed by our friend John Carrots, Morals and Machines, Theology and AI Technology, where John explored some of these questions. So John, I'm curious what your thoughts on the discussion are, particularly the role of humans as creators and how this relates to the potential power of the entities that we would be creating and the kinds of checks and balances that we would want to see with respect to that power.
Yeah, I have a lot of notes here. Actually, one of them was checks and balances. So that's good you said that. A couple things I want to get first. I do want to simulate you, Cannon. I want you more for all your minerals, not just the carbon. But I did like what Art brought up, though, which hinges on things I wanted when he said about the alpha. And, of course, he also mentioned StarNet. I call it StarNet. We all know the reference to Terminator. You know, Elon Musk is building his StarNet. I think we've seen this in the movies. But just wanted to say quick, too, if the smart people took good vitamins, if they knew somebody they could get good vitamins from, they probably could also be using the clubs. Not have to be just being the people beat there. That's a reference back to Cannon's business there. But as far as the alpha, I think the problem is some of that comes to the fact that people will worship an alpha or let an alpha rule because he supports their own greed. I think people have greeds of what they want, and if they think that the person in charge will help them get that and help them move in the direction of what they want, even if it's not for the greater good, but it's for their good, that they follow him in that manner. And that's what brings me back to my main concern a lot of times about AI. And people say, they think, oh, well, the world will be better when AI rules it. And I always worry, well, man is creating the AI right now. And also I worry about the fact that some of our shortcomings might not just because we're biological. Some of our shortcomings might be an issue of intelligence to begin with. It was mentioned earlier about, if you have all the power and you want to make a deal for something somebody else has that is of lesser power, you don't care because you take it over. But I think sometimes greed and maybe what we look at is racism and nationalism and some of that stuff that we see humans do and have always done through history. Once AI becomes intelligent, it might be a trait that is part of the intelligence, as in its own something that develops to keep itself alive and keep itself, getting what it needs and everything. And that is my concern, that that is a function of intelligence. I mean, we hope that it's not. I mean, we mentioned unicorns here too, and I have to admit, some of us here already are kind of unicorns ourselves already, because we care about things about everybody and how things are turned out. But is that how man on the whole thinks, or is man on the whole kind of greedy and self-centered and want things for themselves? I mean, I hate to say that and be mean about it, and we talk about decentralizing, but sometimes the way governments are built on top of each other with checks and balances, and like our country having the states, well, there's a difference, as I say, difference between states and commonwealths, where commonwealths, the communities have power that, to make certain rules over how states are and stuff, where we have smaller bodies that have the ability within the law to make certain laws, and then the higher government controls other things, and how you try to have a layer of government that controls things. And, I think to some extent the UN was originally designed to try and help the whole world in that way too, but I don't think it has the power it could have. But then that scares people too when you say that, because then the UN would be centralizing. But my point is, I'm also concerned that sometimes human nature, if you totally decentralize it, is there enough unicorns out there to keep us all trying to help each other? Or will people try to go with the decentralization also to better themselves, not to better the greater good? So I always worry about that. I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate a little bit here. That's always been my fear. I support space travel too, and I always am afraid that I think we go out to space and we conquest and it'll help our planet because we're going to be working off resources on other planets. But then I'm afraid we're just going to be a swarm of locusts that just consumes and moves outward and consumes other things and leaves the wreckage behind us. I wish there was a way to know that man and artificial intelligence would always be concerned for each other and the greater good of the whole, but I'm not always sure about that. So that's my concern. I think that's kind of what I'm concerned about. And I'm afraid that maybe man kind of is like a Borg in a way, and we want to consume and take things over, and I am sometimes worried that without all the checks and balances I think sometimes governments try to do that. I think our Democratic Republic tries to do it. I think there's a lot of things that are good in concept, but are actually hard to make perfect. I agree that, also with people talking about our police forces and stuff and things they do. I've had long hair on and off through my life, and I've been profiled. And you think to yourself, they profiled me because of my long hair. I've been picked up on a bicycle with a bag because they thought I might be transporting drugs when I was going to Blockbuster. And I was picked up in my Volkswagen Beetle going to the gym late at night because I looked like a subversive. They told me I had lights out that weren't. But profiling, and an example why I'm saying this is, you think to yourself, that's fair. But then again, you think to it and say, but how could I make that better? I'm not sure. So I think there's a lot of things we need to work better, but I'm also concerned with what's at the core of people, and also when machines get intelligent, won't that maybe be at the core of them also? So those are my concerns. I'll start rambling here, but it just worries me in the long run, So that was my thought. Sorry.
John, thanks for bringing up that important point. I actually had intended to address something like this earlier. You're pointing out in somewhat different words that anarchy is not a dependable form of what somebody might think of as decentralization. When we're talking about decentralization, we can't just imagine rules going away. We can't just imagine everybody being somehow magically equal with each other and doing the right thing because we're all kind-hearted. That just creates skepticism in you for good reason, for all the same reasons that we should be skeptical that it's a good bet to bet on a concentration of power in any one person. When there's no rules in place, people do whatever the hell they want. And that's by definition what anarchy is, right? Now, in anarchy, there's still, as long as there happens to be a period of time in the anarchy when people are proximate in power, there's still the natural incentive to cooperate. But what happens in anarchy is very quickly, perhaps out of just dumb luck initially, some people manage to accumulate some power, and then they use that additional power to reinforce their power, to accumulate more power, and dictatorships emerge. We see this all the time in places where there haven't been strong governments for periods of time, where there has been essentially anarchy. Over some period of time, it's not some kind of good-hearted general liberal libertarianism that emerges. No, it's a dictator invariably who emerges, who happens to get enough power to on his or her own to take over and start running things. And so when we're talking about decentralization of power, and when we're observing that it's the most probable way to promote human flourishing, we're not talking about anarchy. We're talking about formal decentralization, which requires real governance, which requires real systems and real institutions, formalized mechanisms for interacting with each other and cooperating with each other. You might think of it as like the internet. The internet is not at all an anarchy. It only works because all of the nodes on the internet agree on a protocol. IP, right? We all have IP addresses, and those IP addresses have a way of communicating packets with each other. And they follow that protocol, otherwise they can't communicate with each other. A decentralized system still has to have formal rules and still has to abide by those rules, or it collapses into something else. Maybe it will temporarily be an anarchy, but then power will accumulate and a centralized authority will come back in place, and then all bets are off, because that centralized authority might be a unicorn or it might be a basilisk. You don't know, right? And so to your point, we can't just gamble on unicorns. I mean, we can, but it's foolish. We shouldn't gamble on unicorns. Let's hope for all the unicorns in the universe. But in the meantime, let's establish formal decentralized systems that greatly increase the odds and even necessitate the odds of cooperation. And then we can be highly confident in the outcomes. The outcomes will be cooperative achievement of instrumental goals. And we can still maintain a diversity of final goals with quite a high level of diversity, as long as those final goals aren't the destruction of the decentralized network. But barring those sorts of final goals, we can entertain and support and cultivate all kinds of final goals, as long as we create a formal decentralized system that facilitates cooperation around our instrumental goals.
Yes, thank you, Lincoln. And it's interesting that when you were speaking about anarchy devolving into dictatorship, John H. pointed out that alphas take over in those kinds of situations. And we had a previous conversation about Elon Musk and perhaps the danger even of putting one's trust in an individual like that, who has shown to be hyper competent and quite effective in certain realms, for instance, electric vehicles or space travel or underground tunnels, or ideas like the Hyperloop, which may yet transform our transportation infrastructure for the better. And yet, recently, Elon Musk came out with this absolutely absurd statement about how it's desirable for death to occur because otherwise human societies will stagnate with the same individuals around. And of course, we in the longevity movement think that that is quite a fallacious argument. But if Elon Musk had all of the power, he may try to instantiate certain technological visions, but he would not contribute to the fight against senescence and death. And indeed, if he had absolute power, he might try to hinder the fight against senescence and death unless somebody persuaded him of the contrary position. So that illustrates the danger of investing too much authority, even in a person who has a demonstrated record of accomplishment and visionary thinking. There was also an interesting comment in this regard from S in our YouTube chat, who stated with regard to an alpha type personality, though that's not exactly a scientific term, but we'll use it, an alpha type personality being invested in power. That's what happened with Putin. Everyone liked him in Russia, at least in the early 2000s, because he came across as a competent leader and the only leader in ages they were not ashamed of. And yet, because he was invested with such a large degree of power, because he was ultimately able to consolidate power to the exclusion of any critics or dissenters or figures who could have formed countervailing blocs, Russia and the entirety of the world, indeed, became vulnerable to Putin's personal idiosyncrasies. And now we see the risks of that with him having control of a nuclear arsenal and starting a war that was completely irrational and against his best interests to start, just because he was enamored of a certain view of history and certain geopolitical fantasies, let's say. But it really does speak to the importance of decentralization, because even if someone has favorable, virtuous characteristics, one still should have checks and balances with regard to that individual. So now I would like to ask Ben Ballweg if he has any questions or comments.
I'll start with a hat tip to John H.'s comment about using the law to circumvent the law. I think I've felt concerned that even religion sometimes, like, it's used to get the masses to do what those in power want them to do, and then the powerful can keep their power. So thank you, John H. Lincoln, you are convincing me of why decentralization would be good. The how part seems to be difficult. I was thinking maybe you can get people that have some power to buy into this decentralization thing if they think, oh, maybe I can get even more power, like a greed for power would allow decentralization to happen. And then we have like Art Ramon's comment about you have this alpha worship, and then you have John K saying that people alpha worship also because they just want more power for themselves. So how do we get those that have the power and stand to lose power from a decentralization scenario to get on board?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't have all the answers to that, but I think we have a great case study to look at with blockchain technology. It is currently facing really strong resistance from some incumbent powers in traditional finance, some incumbent powers in the governments of the world. And then some players have embraced blockchain technology. Some governments have embraced it wholeheartedly. And there's an interest. And now, how did that all get started? Well, it started very slowly and accumulated over time. And it would be really intriguing to look at the sociocultural dynamics that led us to the point where we are now. But I mainly want to comment on where we are now with this in relation to your question, because what we see now is something that's a little bit, there's some, we can apply some game theory to it. As more nation states and as more, individuals who are powerful by traditional financial measures embrace blockchain technologies and start accumulating wealth in blockchain technologies, it increases the urgency for other players to jump on board before it's too late, before they don't have an incentive to get those benefits either. But there's a trade-off. They don't want to jump on, they don't want this new paradigm of finance to take over, because it will weaken their centralized control of their finances that they have today. But if they wait too long, and if it does turn out to be successful, then they won't have power in that new paradigm. And that's this interesting balancing act that we found ourselves in today, where a lot of corporations and a lot of governments are trying to weigh the risk reward benefit of getting into the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, because they're not they're not certain yet whether it's undermining their traditional centralized power or whether it's time to get in before it's too late to get some of this new decentralized power that's going to be essential for everybody to have if they don't want to be disenfranchised, right? And so I think we could look at something like that going back in time in the blockchain space to kind of answer the question about how do we get people involved? How do we get the powerful to give up their power? Well, the answer to that is the powerful don't give up their power. But you can incentivize people to buy in to a new paradigm of power if it's in their interest. And so those of us who don't have massive accumulations of traditional power have had incentive historically to bolster up the strength of blockchain and cryptocurrency. And now as it's getting more powerful, it's starting to incentivize more people who had more power in traditional financial means, and they're starting to jump on board. And we've seen a lot of that over the last year, especially in 2021. There were many more large investors and even governments such as Ecuador who have jumped on board the cryptocurrency blockchain movement because it got to the point where they assessed that it was in their interest. And so I think that's the answer to your question, is that we have to somehow figure out ways of incentivizing the powerful to embrace it rather than trying to fight them for it. Now, in some cases, there will be really bad actors. In my opinion, it's pretty clear Putin is a bad actor right now that we'll have to fight against in various ways. But on the whole, I think we want to keep fighting to a minimum. And what we want to do is reshape incentives so that there are constructive reasons for the powerful to join into the decentralized network and get a benefit from doing so if we can provide that. And I think that's the best way overall going forward. But there will, along the way, there will be, revolutions, and there will be pains and sufferings along the way. That's how all evolution works, for better and for worse. But hopefully incentives can be created that are increasingly enticing for the powerful to join in.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Lincoln. And I definitely share your hope that such incentives can be created. I would also like to thank Alan Crowley for his generous contribution. He says, thanks to the whole team and our guest, Lincoln Cannon. Keep up the good work. And we have about 1 minute left in our virtual Enlightenment Salon. Time passes quickly, but I am curious, Lincoln, in terms of your closing words, I'd be interested to hear you address a question from John H., who essentially wonders what the end goal of decentralization is. Is it decentralization for the sake of decentralization, or is it a greater goal like human flourishing, for instance?
For sure, the greater goal of human flourishing. I want to live in a world with radically compassionate and radically creative intelligences, and I want to be one of them. I want you to be among them. I want to live in worlds that are beautiful and that require real courage, but that have very compassionate and creative outcomes. That's the kind of world I want to live in. And I want to create I want to ensure the greatest probability that we can have of achieving that. And that's why I care about decentralization, because it gives us the best odds of living in that beautiful world.
Yes, thank you very much, Lincoln, for joining us today. And I hope that is a beautiful world that we can achieve in spite of all the obstacles, in spite of all the turbulence that our species faces right now. But the Transhumanist Party strives toward constructive alternatives, and the world of decentralization that Lincoln described is indeed such an alternative. I hope we can achieve it. I hope we can live to see it. And until next time, every Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time, I hope that we all live long and prosper.